Hello, everybody. Thanks to all of you for either staying on campus or probably even more heroically for driving and parking on campus on a Thursday afternoon. And thanks to those of you tuning in on YouTube, either live or in the future at some point. Your support is always hugely appreciated. Thanks too to Erica, our newish Associate Director for Exhibitions and Public Programs, as well as Grace, Doug, Ashley, and everybody else at the center, and our incredible volunteer team for putting in the work to pull off this program. And of course, I have to thank the Pforzheimer Foundation, even though it's been disbanded for a few years now. They so generously endowed my position and all things ye olde here at the Ransom Center when we acquired the Pforzheimer Library in 1986. But enough of that kind of preamble. My main job is to introduce our speaker, a man who is himself a nearly unmatched professional at introductions. Despite being a castanet, a former PhD student of David's, I am definitely no David Scott Kastan, but I will try my best here. David is the George M. Bottleman Professor Emeritus of English at Yale University and is widely and rightly regarded as one of the foremost experts on Shakespeare and early modern literature and culture more generally, especially as it concerns the details surrounding the staging and print circulation of his plays and poetry. So this is the easy part of my intro. The tricky thing is knowing where and how to stop once I start putting meat on the bones that I've just laid out here. He's done so much to advance the field, as well as the careers and the lives of his students. Beginning his own career at a time when the academic study of Shakespeare was entering the grip of a set of methodological approaches that usually traffic under the label of theory, and capital T is very firmly there. Kastan has time and time again emphasized that understanding Shakespeare requires something that may now seem quite basic, even obvious: good history. As he writes in Shakespeare After Theory, his work is dedicated to documenting how the sausage that is Shakespeare's writing got made. He just wants to, quote, examine Shakespeare's plays as they appeared as both drama and as texts. Now that's easier said than done, as decades of important scholarship that has expanded, refined, and yes, sometimes simply disagreed with Eric's work or David's work demonstrates. Even when today's literary historians don't realize it, they're indebted to David's efforts to remake room in Shakespeare studies for well-evidenced, good old-fashioned history, which David and his friend Peter Stallybrass have long referred to as, quote, the new boredom, a riff on the new bibliography, an early 20th century movement to document in retina-detaching detail how early modern books, Shakespeare's first and foremost among them, made their way from manuscript and into print. David's first monograph, Shakespeare in the Shapes of Time, offers an approach to the playwright's histories, tragedies, and late comedies, often called the romances, as genres invested in different approaches to time, about the relationship between what has already happened and what is yet to come, and the implications of that relationship for, human existence. In this early work, David shows himself a careful, close reader who is simultaneously sensitive to historical context, particularly to the different options available to Shakespeare for thinking about divine providence, God's role in the temporal sphere. And that's all very high-minded, but my favorite thing about David's first book is its attention to John Bale, who is arguably the most pissed-off figure of the English Reformation and is my anti-hero par excellence. I probably shouldn't admit this here, but I have at least 3 John Bale-related tattoos, so this is the level of the commitment. David is arguably best known today for his work in book history. Shakespeare the book remains a necessary stop for scholars, and this is certainly what made me want to work with him on my PhD, and is part of why I've invited him to speak as part of the Pforzheimer lecture series. But I've spent most of my time, or some of my time just now, looking back to Shakespeare in the Shapes of Time, because it can help remind us that, whereas book history for me and some others of my peers has offered a way to work on Shakespeare without actually having to read Shakespeare, David has always kept his eye on the prize of understanding what the hell is going on in the plays and poetry, and how we might understand what the man was up to and what his contemporaries thought about him and his work. I consider myself a book trade and economic historian who uses the publishing history of drama to better understand the book trade. David is an actual scholar of early modern literature. When advocating for the new boredom in Shakespeare after theory, David warned against, as much as possible, an inclination to see ourselves, our concerns, in the literature from the past that we read. And here's a long quote that I just like a lot. What value Shakespeare has for us must, at least begin with the recognition of his difference from us. Only then can we be sure that what we hear are his concerns rather than the projections of our own. Other minds have moral relevance for us only when we recognize them as other minds. This is perhaps justification enough for wanting to read Shakespeare historically. History functions as some apotropaic fetish to ward off our narcissism, or at least prevent the premature imposition of present-day interests and values. Now, David, like me, definitely likes to talk and is not immune to at least a tiny bit of narcissism, but who is? But his scholarly commitment to bracketing his own concerns to better understand historical writers and readers on their own terms is mirrored by his great personal generosity. His efforts to use his status in the profession and the connections that he's made on behalf of students. He's a great scholar, but he's perhaps an even better mentor and a friend. While at Yale, David sacrificed one night every week to get the early modern grad students in the English department together and buzzed on wine to discuss each other's work, and in the process to learn to write, offer constructive criticism, and learn how to receive and respond to that constructive criticism without being a weirdo. There wasn't really anything in it for David. He didn't have to spend his evenings on campus and lighten his wallet by paying for the wine each week. But he did, I think, because he understood that what we did in that room together was easily as important as any coursework we took, and because, as far as he let on, he actually enjoys thinking alongside students as future colleagues. I think dinner last night was the first time, and I've known him since 2010, that I successfully managed to trick David into letting me pay for anything. And we've had many, many, many discussions over a burger and a beer or three. It's my understanding that back when I applied to Yale, he plucked my materials out of the meh pile and advocated for my admission into that program. And I know with more confidence that David has managed to convince not one, but two institutions to hire me, despite my very obviously rough edges. Now, I've still never been privy to one of his recommendation letters, but damn, they must be good. Now, I could go on and say a lot about all other kinds of things of David, but those are probably left for more drinks. But I'm going to shut up now and let my favorite person in this weird profession of ours show you a little of what makes me admire him so much. Please join me in welcoming David Scott Kastan. We're very close.
We're close. Good.
I have some faith here.
It'll work. It doesn't matter.
There we go.
It doesn't matter. That's what we put numbers on pages for.
There we are.
All right. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I feel this is a rather niche kind of pre-gaming for the Georgia-Texas game. You know, I just thought, like, wow, what a cool thing to do before the real party begins. So I'm really thrilled to be here. Aaron is one of my favorite people in the world. I don't know what I had to do with getting him hired, but you're very lucky to have him in your midst. He is quite terrific. Let me see that I have this. So, yeah, Lucrece. In the spring of 1594, a long narrative poem by Shakespeare was published. and advertised for sale at John Harrison's shop in London in the churchyard of St. Paul's, the cathedral in London, where most of the book stalls were around two of the sides of it. In the fall of that year, an anonymous introductory poem, Henry Willoughby's Willoughby His Avisa, included the first independent mention of Shakespeare in print. This anonymous poet describes Willoughby's poem as another English response to Livy's account of Lucrece's virtue. Shakespeare paints poor Lucrece's rape. But in Willoughby's Avisa, English virtue and English verse are celebrated together. Unsurprisingly, the comparison does not work in Willoughby's favor, but in any case, the claim about Shakespeare is literally untrue. Shakespeare didn't paint anything. In 1613, by the way, he did design an impresa for the Earl of Rutland and was paid 44 shillings for that. But the actual making and painting of it, as the bill says, 44 shillings were also paid to Richard Burbage. Burbage painted, Shakespeare did not. Shakespeare didn't paint anything, although I suppose we can forgive the metaphor, but he didn't even metaphorically paint the rape of Lucrece in the poem that bears her name. In Shakespeare's poem, the rape seems to take place in the space of a comma. The wolf hath seized his prey, the poor lamb cries. Or maybe it happens soon after, in a stanza break between lines 686 and 687, which in the first edition involves turning the page over. There's a lot of before and after in Shakespeare's poem, but the rape itself, although it happens at some point, does not appear at all. This is not, however, merely a narratological or grammatical observation. Its absence from the poem cannot reflect any reluctance on Shakespeare's part to confront the horrible reality of rape. Think Titus Andronicus. By the way, one way to think about this talk is there are sort of four texts that figure in it from beginning to end, and they all were written in 1594, which is random but interesting. It's, you know, one of the ways to think about how texts function is to see what else is functioning at the same moment. That, of course, things get read at different times, but just this random point. But the fact that Shakespeare seems so reluctant to actually engage the reality of rape might indicate that Shakespeare understood that as a reality, rape actually belongs to the victim. Or at the very least, he understands that narrativizing rape insensitively risks eroticizing it. Lucrece was the graver labor, a phrase he uses in his dedication of Venus and Adonis to the Earl of Southampton. That earlier poem might have been thought sophisticated softcore pornography. In the first part of The Return from Parnassus, an anonymous university play from 1600, the foppish Giulio plans to woo, he says, in pure Shakespeare. And then he says, I'll worship sweet master Shakespeare, and to honor him will lay his Venus and Adonis under my pillow. Honoring Shakespeare probably wasn't Giulio's primary purpose in keeping Venus and Adonis in his bed. The poem was ready at hand for many a young man who list read lust, in Thomas Freeman's phrase in his 1614 epigram to Master William Shakespeare. Venus and Adonis was Renaissance softcore porn, one of the many reasons it really is Shakespeare's bestseller. Always good to keep these facts in mind. But Lucrece was not a book designed either to arouse or instruct the would-be Lothario, but as one of those demanding works like Hamlet, as Gabriel Harvey wrote, that have it in them to please the wiser sort. Certainly Lucrece doesn't titillate. It could put you off sex altogether, and it has. In various accounts, the poem is about law, ethics, rhetoric, patriarchy, or politics. In early modern England, it might easily be thought that all of those are just versions of a single ideology. In fairness, Lucrece was not intended to be about sex. It's about rape. And the poem seems to conceive of rape as the perverse practice for which those various discourses provide the enabling theory. And yet, by some definitions, Lucrece has not been raped. That may turn out to be the more unsettling explanation for why the rape is not explicitly an event in the poem. In the long history of the Lucretia story, there's a very nice Lucretia painting in the Blanton that some of you may know. Luca Cambiaso has a suicide of Lucretia painting that's very interesting to look at and raises some of the same concerns of the talk today. But there's always been, in this long history of the Lucretia story, some suggestion that however reluctantly, Lucrece had consented. The inevitable qualification, usually it's some version of under duress, should make it clear that there must be a more appropriate word for what she's done. Duress would seem to nullify the very idea of consent. Surrendered might be a better word than consented, but it's difficult to come to terms, one might say, with what she has done. Suffered, certainly, but ultimately not even survived. At least as the poem is concerned, there's no good term for what's been done to her. Now, that isn't the case for the poem's preliminary prose argument. There, Lucrece is said to have been violently ravished. The poem itself, however, is much less forthcoming about what's taken place. I would like it if there it goes. Although it's worth remembering that the rape of Lucrece appears on almost every page of the poem's early printings, as the running title serves as a header. But only in 1616, in the year of Shakespeare's death, in its 6th edition, did the poem itself be called something other than just Lucrece, as you saw at the beginning. There, for the first time, the rape of Lucrece becomes the poem's title, as well as the first printing to include Shakespeare's name on the title page. The poem wasn't actually newly revised, as the title page advertises, although a few minor changes have been made from the earlier editions, a couple times just to regularize meter. Shakespeare writes blackest, and it's an extra syllable, and the 6th edition changes it to black. But now, Lucrece's rape appears in much the largest font on the page. It's an unusual typographical design. I mean, Aaron and I and some of you, we've looked at a million title pages, and it's rare to see something kind of this odd. It's unusual, but especially for a poem in which you cannot clearly locate exactly where the rape occurs, or maybe even decide if it was a rape at all. A publisher, however, might have thought this might help sell some books. The word rape, however, is used only twice in the poem, and on neither occasion is directly related to Lucrece's experience. It's used once in reference to the rape of Helen of Troy, and it appears the other time in a list of despicable human behaviors that an abstract opportunity permits: wrath, envy, treason, rape, and murder's rages. Each usefully marks a distinct sense of the English word rape. Helen of Troy's rape comes from the Latin raptus, which means abduction, and marks rape as a crime against male property. The physical rape, allowed by opportunity, is the English translation of a different word, stuprum, which is the Latin word used to refer to a violent crime against, usually, a woman's body. Both senses of rape are present in Shakespeare's poem, but it's the sense derived from stuprum that seems to cause most of the problems. The difficulty is legible in the sources. Livy says that Lucrece was overcome as if with force. It's the as if that complicates things. I suppose Livy means only that the credible threat of force was enough to ensure her submission, and the fact that Tarquin restrains her on her bed with a sword in his hand makes that threat undoubtedly credible. That as if, however, would have been exculpatory under Roman law, which specifically defined rape as intercourse by force, although it isn't obvious how Shakespeare would have known that, or why the drawn sword wouldn't count as force for Livy. In Ovid's Fasti, the other classical source for the Lucrece story, Lucrece is also overcome, although there it's by fear for her reputation. And in Shakespeare's poem, it becomes more complicated still. Tarquin wronged me, I, Collatine was her husband. Lucrece says, carefully choosing a verb that's capable of distributing the transgression between clauses. Tarquin wronged me, I wronged Collatine. Raped wouldn't work in that sentence. She admits that she feared by Tarquin's falchion, a kind of sword, she feared by Tarquin's falchion to be slain, but after the rape, she quickly focuses on her own offenses, her unseen guilt, and her helpless shame. The language uncomfortably conflates what has been done to her with what she thinks she has done. It should be enough that she didn't consent, but that's not enough even for her. One influential commentator on the classical Lucrece story insisted, however, that there must have been consent. In the City of God, St. Augustine asks why, if she had not consented, would she commit suicide? If she be chaste, why did she kill herself, Augustine asks. And then, out of nowhere, he begins to wonder, what if it were so, which none could know but herself, that though Tarquinius's son offered her force, yet she herself gave a lustful consent, and after did so grieve at that she held it worthy to be punished with death. It's certainly an odd bit of wondering, made still odder by a commentary note on the same page in the 1610 edition, provided by the Spanish humanist Juan Luis Vives, who glosses Augustine's "which none could know," for who can tell whether she gave consent by the touch of some incited pleasure? Wow. An imagined somatic response to nerve stimulation could serve as evidence that the act was not rape. It could reasonably be thought, Augustine writes, that was suffered with the consent of the mind, which it may be could not be suffered without some delight of the flesh. Well, so much for consent serving as a compelling ethical or legal principle. There's no hope for the principle if consent can be understood as being given by the touch of some incited pleasure. And in any case, consent is usually understood only as a response to power rather than a full participant in it, and it inevitably serves as power's legitimation. But in Shakespeare's poem, there's neither delight of the flesh nor consent of the mind, although the fact that Lucrece feels it necessary to deny any of what she calls accessory yieldings reveals that she knows exactly how her story will be told unless she can take control of the narrative. In the anonymous tragedy of, did I do something bad? Yes, good. In the anonymous tragedy of Nero, the 1624 play, you can see how far it might get away from her. Petronius imagines a scene in which fair Lucrece lies by Tarquin's lusty side and woos him now again to ravish her. Now, that of course is not at all what happens in Shakespeare's poem. Lucrece resists and tries to convince Tarquin not to stoop to foul desire. Sadly, her tears work only to harden lust, in the poem's all too predictable verb, as Tarquin insists that she yield to him. He sets his foot upon the light before, well, we don't know. We're not allowed access to what comes next. We know only that he uses her nightdress to stifle her outcry before we are told that she hath lost a dearer thing than life. What we don't know is how she has lost that dearer thing, or even what that thing precisely is. It shouldn't be her honor or reputation, though she has lost her innocence and sense of safety in the world. And we do know that whatever it wasn't really lost. It was taken from her. Strangely, the poem discourages us from thinking about any of this. It immediately shifts to what Tarquin has lost, or what he wishes he now might lose. He hath won what he would lose again. Only then does the poem belatedly invite us to look after the act's accomplishment. And when we were told that the spotted princess is asked how she fares after her consecrated wall has been battered down, it must come as some surprise to realize that the lines refer not to Lucrece's violated body, but to Tarquin's defiled soul. It takes quite a while for the poem to make Lucrece the subject rather than an object, but that's part of the poem's point. At the end of the poem, Lucrece provides her own account of what has taken place. She offers herself as a witness, reliving the rape, even as she must alienate herself from her experience of it in order to do so. Her testimony confirms what the narrator has earlier reported. She tells the men of Tarquin's terrible threats. For some hard-favored groom of thine, quoth he, Tarquin, unless thou yoke thy liking to my will, I'll murder straight. And then I'll slaughter thee, and swear I found you where you did fulfill the loathsome act of lust, and so did kill the lechers in their deed. This act will be my fame and thy perpetual infamy. And then against my heart he set his sword, swearing, unless I took all patiently, I should not live to speak another word, so should my shame still rest upon record. Lucrece has been gagged, threatened with a deadly weapon, and what to her is seemingly of greater consequence, with the promise of perpetual infamy. She did deny, and she did not yoke her liking to his will, and surely this should be enough to clear her of any suggestion of complicity. The violence registers in the incoherence of her reaction, trying to make sense of an experience that cannot make sense, should never make sense, should never happen, but it does. She's been raped, and she rails against everything that has conspired to enable this to happen. Comfort-killing night, who's guilty of her cureless crime. Opportunity, whose guilt is great, and injurious shifting time. She's been a victim of dreadful circumstance. The abstract and impersonal language understandably fails to register the immediate horror of her experience, which is exactly what it's designed to do. And she does rail against the guilty Tarquin, but even more against the infuriating inability of all this railing to change or improve a thing. In vain, she says, I rail at opportunity, at time, at Tarquin, and uncheerful night. In vain I cavil with my infamy. In vain I spurn at my despite. This helpless smoke of words doth me no right. The compulsive repetition of in vain makes its own self-evident point about the emptiness of the rhetoric of complaint, although there's still more rhetoric to come. But all her words are but helpless smoke, idle words, unprofitable sounds, weak arbitrators. There is, however, one word that might not have been able. Philomele. The grisly story of Philomele was well known, mainly from Ovid's Metamorphoses. She was raped by her brother-in-law Tereus, who then cut out her tongue to prevent her from accusing him, and then, grotesquely, continued to work what Ovid calls his lustful will again and again upon the poor mangled form. It's obviously a shocking account which somehow its literary familiarity has ameliorated. It's undergone its own metamorphosis into a story of female resistance and resilience in the face of male violence. Grief hath sharp wits, says Ovid, and in trouble cunning comes. The abused Philomele weaves the story of her violation and persuades a servant to deliver the incriminating tapestry to her sister Procne. Philomele's weaving has been often taken as an image of art's ability to counter the unspeakable cruelty of the world, a distinctly female language that refuses to be silenced by the atrocities of male violence. And Philomele herself, along with her sister Procne, becomes an agent of revenge, killing Tereus' son Idas and serving him up as a meal for his father unknowingly to dine upon. But in Shakespeare's poem, Philomele, as is usually forgotten, is only elusively a figure either of art or of vengeance. Philomele is just an elegant synonym in the poem for the nightingale, a linguistic metamorphosis paralleling the mythic one, in which Philomele is transformed into a bird to escape the fury of Tereus once he learns what the sisters have done in serving up his son in a pie. In the poem Lamenting Philomele, ending the well-tuned warble of her nightly sorrow, is a temporal marker, announcing the end of the solemn night in which Lucrece's grief has been sequestered. And when Lucrece later calls, "Come, Philomele," it's neither to focus her grief nor to animate her rage, but only to have the night once again supplant the peeping sun, since now cloudy Lucrece shames herself to see. What Lucrece plans to imitate is not the vengeful Philomele, but only the nightingale, as Lucrece too seeks to keep her sharp woes waking. It's the nightingale who proverbially uses a thorn to keep herself awake, to sing through the night of her sorrow, although in fact it's only the male nightingale who sings. The mythic Philomele chooses murder over masochism in her grisly act of revenge, but Lucrece is too much the proper Roman matron for that. Nonetheless, an early reader of the poem, the royalist poet John Quarles, wrote his own version of the Lucrece story, which was published along with Shakespeare's Lucrece in an edition of 1655. Quarles' poem is called The Banishment of Tarquin, or The Reward of Lust. Quarles gives the nightingale's agency. Led by Philomele, they flocked about Tarquin and picked out his eyes. But in Shakespeare's poem, Philomele is not an inspiration for Lucrece to enact her revenge. It becomes just one more idle word, once it's been metaphorized, eradicating the potency that it might have spoken once it's been culturally repurposed. Even the letter Lucrece writes to Collatine only allows her certain sorrow to be writ uncertainly. It permits her husband to know her grief, but not her grief's true quality, because, as she says, more it is than I can well express. It's unspeakable. But there's also her own anxiety about how the information will be received. She dares not thereof make discovery, lest he should hold it her own gross abuse. That anxiety is always there in the poem for Lucrece, the fear that she will be blamed for her rape, and it turns out she has been by St. Augustine. She knows her culture all too well. Words, Lucrece knows, will never be enough to clear her of that suspicion which the world might bear her. And they're unlikely ever to be enough to allow her to revise and redescribe her experience so that the disgrace would not be her own and her rage could be directed at Tarquin. It comes as no surprise and comes with some relief that here she pauses what's an exhausting lament and seeks, she says, for means to mourn some newer way. The poem pauses, too, at this moment, focusing on a different medium, not verbal but visual, a piece of skillful painting made for Priam's Troy. Narratively, what the episode does is fill the time to allow the messenger to take her letter to her father and her husband, and for them to have time to return to Calatia, Colatine's palace outside of Rome. For Lucrece, on the other hand, the encounter with the painting allows her to escape her abjection. The painting of the Fall of Troy is not any painting that Shakespeare had seen, but it's a painting that's created only by Shakespeare's poetic skill. The episode is Shakespeare's most consequential addition to the source material he had inherited. It's one of literature's most famous examples of what scholars call ekphrasis, the idea of describing some object verbally. Famous example, Homer's description of the shield of Achilles, or Henry James' description of the Bronzino painting. It's Shakespeare's contribution to a long-running debate between painting and poetry, mute pictures set against speaking poetry. Shakespeare's contemporary Edmund Spenser praises the poet's wit in The Faerie Queene that passeth painter far, and perhaps Shakespeare, though at much greater length, does the same. The episode in the poem is long, over 200 lines, longer than Ovid's treatment of the entirety of the Lucrece story is in his Fasti. But Shakespeare doesn't seem anxious about the conventional competition between art forms. In fact, what actually is important about the well-painted piece in the poem is how little interest Lucrece has in it, although in her circumstances it could hardly be otherwise. Her passions are aroused, but she came to the painting with her passions already aroused. The painting provides no new understanding of her situation. It only confirms what she already feels. Its artistry is not, and could never be at this moment, of any real concern to her. Critics have talked endlessly about these 203 lines, but they've missed what seems to me the central point. It's only the narrator in the poem who's actually interested in the painting. He, of course it's a he, has the luxury to be a sophisticated and sensitive viewer. He is the one admiringly alert to the sweet observance in this work, as he says. He praises the artist's ability to capture and individualize emotion, rendering faces with a wondrous art of physiognomy, so that their manners most expressly told, as well as the painter's proficiency in organizing the density of the chaotic history on the painting's two-dimensional surface. Figures are arranged, some high, some low. The painter was so nice. Nice in Elizabethan English means subtle or skilled or ingenious. The scalps of many almost hid behind, to jump up higher seemed to mock the mind. The receding overlaps often prevent the painted figures from being shown in their entirety, but the knowledgeable viewer understands how to understand the painterly conventions, for such imaginary work was there, conceit deceitful, so compact, so kind, that for Achilles' image stood his spear, gripped in an armed hand, himself behind was left unseen, save to the eye of mind. A hand, a foot, a face, a leg, a head, stood for the whole to be imagined. The art historian in the 1950s, Ernst Gombrich, was the first to recognize the similarity of the stanza to his description of Philostratus the Elder of a painting of the siege of Troy. The clever artifice of the painter is delightful, says Philostratus, encompassing passing the walls with armed men. He depicts them so that some are seen in full figure, others with the legs hidden, others from the waist up, then only the busts of some, heads only, helmets only, and finally just spear points. This, my boy, is perspective, since the problem is to deceive the eye as they travel, the eyes as they travel back along with the proper receding planes of the picture. But the only perspective Lucrece is interested in is her own. Although the narrator says that the time that she with painted images hath spent has brought her from the feeling of her own grief by deep surmise of others' detriment, It's much more accurate to say that her grief has brought Lucrece to the painted images. The deep surmise of others' detriment provides her no relief, and it's almost all her own projection. The narrator directs the reader's attention to the 1,000 lamentable objects there, repeatedly directing us, the reader, to what one might see or what you might behold. He's the one who believes in the power of art to instruct and delight, or at least to distract. But it doesn't, it couldn't do any of those things for Lucrece. Clearly, she takes no pleasure in the variety of scenes in the painting or in the accomplished techniques of their depiction. Her relationship to the painting is idiosyncratic and undisciplined. Desperate, I think, would be the proper word. She throws her eyes about the painting round, and who she finds forlorn, she doth lament. No less than Tarquin, she has a willful eye. The painting holds, as 'twere, the mirror up to herself. She wants only to find a face where all distress is stelled, portrayed or engraved, not to lose her woes and shows of discontent, as the narrator suggests, but to find a show that would be answerable to her own suffering. She casts about till she despairing Hecuba beheld. Now, you probably remember that in Hamlet, when the actors are visiting Denmark, the prince famously wonders how the traveling player could generate so much emotion in his speech, and all for nothing, for Hecuba. What's Hecuba to him, or he to her, that he should weep for her? But Lucrece knows exactly what Hecuba is to her, and she shapes her sorrow to the beldame's woes. She identifies and she projects. The current of her sorrow charges her engagement with the painting and determines what she sees and how she is set a work. It isn't to write art criticism. The skillful painter has accurately portrayed the physical signs of Hecuba's distress, but Lucrece swears he did her wrong to give her so much grief and not a tongue. Lucrece decides that she will weep for her and tune her woes with my lamenting tongue. And also in the back of this is, of course, Philomele, who gets her tongue cut out by Tereus. The painter provides the image. Lucrece adds a soundtrack and some animation. Viewer and painter become an interactive mixed media installation. To penciled pensiveness and colored sorrow, she lends them words, and she their looks doth borrow. Lucrece promises Hecuba to act on her behalf, to say and do what painted Hecuba obviously cannot. She pledges to drop sweet balm in Priam's painted wound, and rail on Pyrrhus that hath done him wrong, and with my tears quench Troy that burns so long, and with my knife scratch out the angry eyes of all the Greeks that are thine enemies. As Lucrece was being raped, she was afeared to scratch her wicked foe. But now, in front of the painting, she tears the senseless Sinon with her nails. His image finally activates her repressed rage. Patience is quite beaten from her breast. In the Aeneid, of course, Sinon is the Greek warrior who persuades the Trojans to bring the massive wooden horse into the city. The soldiers hidden inside open the gates, allowing the Greek army to overrun Troy. Tarquin's desire for Lucrece is described in similar terms: to make the breach and enter this fair city, he says as he looks upon Lucrece. And looking at the painting, this moment is exactly what Lucrece sees. For even as subtle Sinon here is painted, so sober, so weary, and so mild, to me came Tarquin, armed to beguile with outward honesty, but yet defiled with inward vice. Hecuba's grief is literally a pretext. The painting, the part at least she focuses on, serves mostly as a mirror. To the degree that the painting provides her with some newer way to mourn, then it doesn't come from her identification with Hecuba's painted grief. That was more or less the old way. The newer way is to act. This action comes, however, at the expense of the painting that she tears, and also with the chagrin of realizing that because it's just a painting, Sinan's wounds will not be sore. That is, she has allowed herself to forget that it's only a painting that she's attacked, but it was never the painting that she cared about. One might see this as another version of Pliny's well-known story of the contest between Parrhasius and Zeuxis. Zeuxis exhibited a painting of grapes that were so realistically painted that a flock of birds came to eat them. But Parrhasius won the competition with a painted curtain that Zeuxis asked to be opened so he might see the painting that Parrhasius had submitted. When the prize was then awarded to Parrhasius, Zeuxis graciously accepted the judge's decision, acknowledging with some embarrassment that his own painting had merely deceived some birds. Pliny's story is about the triumph of technical virtuosity, where what is represented can amazingly seem every bit as realistic as the real. But in Shakespeare's poem, when Lucrece tears at the painting, it's not because of its trompe-l'oeil illusionism, but only because she's identified so strongly, first with Hecuba and then with the fate of Troy. She tears at the figure of Sinon, comparing him to that unhappy guest whose deed hath made herself detest. The shock of seeing the torn painting works to return her to the present, but this is the first and only time that the painting registers for her as a work of art. Fool, fool, she says smilingly, and at least the wry recognition of her error works to remind her of the limitations of lament as well as of art's consolations. Finally, she's ready to make good on her declaration that I am the mistress of my fate, and she now composes the sad dirge of her certain ending as a solo performance that ends with her suicide, her swan song. Finally, she takes possession of the narrative, which has had to be almost entirely about possession, although one might have hoped it might have had a less calamitous conclusion. She's been raped, but she could have taken refuge in her knowledge that though my gross blood be stained with this abuse, immaculate and spotless is my mind. Why wasn't that enough? She knows, better than some readers, that she's not guilty of any dishonorable act, and her husband and her father and the other returning lords have reassured her that her body's stain, her mind untainted, clears. But she refuses any absolution. No, no, quoth she, no dame hereafter living by my excuse shall claim excuses giving. This is admittedly crabbed translation, it's Shakespeare's crabbed translation of Livy's, an English version of his Latin, though I acquit myself of the sin, I do not absolve myself from punishments, nor in time to come shall ever unchaste woman live through the example. This is what Shakespeare's excuse means, example. But the idea in both places is that Lucrece's suicide will prevent unchaste women from claiming that they did not consent and so should be absolved since Lucrece has been. Now, the whole episode is a bit grandiose. A more predictable response might have been for her to commit suicide to escape the poison closet of the body that encloses her pure mind. There were classical precedents for that. But she designs her suicide in order that she might make her own excuse. That's never before been an option for her. Always she's played a role in someone else's storytelling. And of course she does in Shakespeare's too, but at least his storytelling was called Lucrece. When Lucrece had first considered suicide, her motive was to protect Colatine's honor. I will not poison thee with my attaint, she tells him. The unseen shame, invisible disgrace, unfelt sore, crest-wounding private scar that she laments are all his, not hers. Crest-wounding refers to the family crest, the literal badge of honor that her rape, or so she thinks, has permanently dishonored and that demands her death. Now, however, it's not his honor, but hers that she protects. If her suicide could be thought to bail her soul from the polluted prison where it breathed, that's an almost accidental effect of the act. What's primary is how she uses it to endow her story with significant form. She addresses her husband and her father as she that was thy Lucrece, but asking to be suddenly revenged on my foe. You know, that was thy Lucrece, but now she wants to be revenged on my foe. The shifting pronouns thy to my mark the process. Once she was theirs, now she's her own. She makes all the assembled lords promise to venge this wrong of mine. She's been wronged, not her husband. She finally takes possession of the narrative and of herself, otherwise being a possession of her husband. She takes possession of that new narrative, the vocabulary, the rhythm, the trajectory. It takes a long time before Lucrece throws out Tarquin's name, though it's the narrator who tells us that. Oddly, she never speaks it here. He, she says, but more than he, her poor tongue could not speak. He, fair lords, 'tis he that guides this hand to give this wound to me, and she stabs herself, as you see in the picture in the Blanton. When Lucrece wrote the letter to her husband, calling him home, she says nothing more than that her woes are tedious, unwilling to say more with words till action might become them better. Now there is becoming action, not the dramatic sighs and groans and tears that she hoped might grace the fashion of her disgrace or her pointless defacing of the painting, but a single decisive act that will revise and redeem her reputation. Her self-slaughtered body serves as eloquent witness to her innocence and to her agency. She claims her place in the legend of good women. There was something more noteworthy than merely a true type of a loyal wife, which is what she knows she has been and what, in this Roman world, she no longer can be, revealing the human limitations of the Roman conception of both marriage and of honor. But this isn't quite where the poem ends. There is the grotesque competition between her husband and her father, arguing literally over her dead body about to whom she belongs and which of them has now lost the most. And then there's Brutus, who pulls the knife from her body and appropriates her corpse for his anti-monarchical intentions. Brutus makes Lucrece the efficient cause of his political ambitions, repurposing her rape and suicide as Rome's disgrace. That is, one might say, he tries to turn Lucrece into the politicized Republican argument that introduces the poem in the printed editions. Lucrece's bleeding body is no longer, and it hasn't been so very long, the sign of her innocence, but is now the evidence of the tyranny of the Tarquins. For Brutus, her suicide is politically expedient, although he sees it as her mistake. To slay herself, that should have slain her foe. But she had elicited their promise that they would be suddenly revenged upon my foe, and that they will let the traitor die. How far the poem retreats from Lucrece's story is that we forget, as do the rebellious lords, that they failed to keep their word. Even earlier, she had decided that her death should serve as the example for his punishment. How Tarquin must be used, she imagined saying to her husband, "Read it in me." But no one reads the text she has written exactly as she has intended it. When they, the assembled lords who followed Brutus to overthrow the Tarquin monarchy, when they had sworn to this advised doom, they did conclude to bear dead Lucrece thence to show her bleeding body through Rome, and to publish Tarquin's foul offense, which being done with speedy diligence, the Romans plausibly did consent to Tarquin's everlasting banishment. Remember, she had made them swear that they would kill him. Lucius Junius Brutus and his followers successfully drive the Tarquins from power and establish the Republic in place of the tyrannical monarchy. But the younger Tarquin is not killed, but merely banished along with his father. It's not justice that they're seeking on Lucrece's behalf, but political change for the state, as well as political opportunity for themselves. With speedy diligence, we're told, but we might wonder about how the adjective inflects the noun, the Romans plausibly did give consent to Tarquin's everlasting banishment. The Arden edition of the poem places the apostrophe in the final line that's absent from the original, as you can see, after the S. It's the family that's banished it, and the Arden edition places the apostrophe differently 3 lines above it when it's referring to the son, Prince Tarquin, the rapist, and both of which seem to me correct. But what has happened to killing Lucrece's foe, as both Brutus and Lucrece had demanded? Look how quickly everything concludes and how much of it is idealized or merely mystified. The closing couplet can hardly convince. The Romans plausibly did give consent to Tarquin's everlasting banishment. Plausibly here means only with applause. The word hadn't yet assumed the tinge of qualification in how we use the word today and how, no doubt, we initially hear it, read it in the poem. But who counts as the Romans who have speedily consented? And to what exactly have they consented? It seems they've consented only to the Tarquins' banishment, with nothing said about any new form of government. But in any case, how can the word consent be used so confidently to authorize the actions that will follow when the story of the rape has put the concept itself under so much pressure? Rome here is spelt room on the page, as it often was, but clearly there's not room in Rome for both the Tarquins and Brutus, although they were closely related. Brutus's mother was the sister of Tarquinius Superbus. And there's also no room for Lucrece any longer. She's served her purpose and now gets completely written out of the story that she's labored so hard to have told. It isn't only from the couplet that she's banished. In the same year that Shakespeare's poem was published, the useful 1594, Richard Beacon, an English political writer with Republican leanings, would write that Brutus, having won the goodwill of the people, was able to change the state of the commonweal without any difficulty, danger, or injury sustained by any other than the expelling of Tarquin. Without any difficulty, danger, or injury sustained by any other than the expelling of Tarquin. How soon they forget. Shakespeare, however, didn't. Thank you.
It was good, yeah.
You know, the famous expression, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's power corrupts, PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. I use it mainly for comic relief.
Well, we have time for like a question or two. I'm very cognizant of getting between people and their receptions, but what do we got?
Since it's a poem nobody knows, it's hard. And it's also kind of horrifying. I've taught it a few times, only a few.
Yeah.
And students are always horrified by it. And in the particular universe we live in, I'm teaching a graduate course at Claremont Graduate University now. And last year I taught a course on Shakespeare and Rembrandt. And Rembrandt, some of you know, does 2 great paintings of Lucretia's suicide. And they're both in America, which is nice. One's in the Minneapolis Museum and the other's in the National Gallery. And I'm teaching the class and on Zoom, and a young woman raised her hand and said, "This is really difficult for me. And I quickly said, if you're uncomfortable, you don't have to be in the, you don't have to stay for the class, just go and I'll happily talk to you about the poem if you want or not. You don't have to think about the poem at all. And she just said, I was raped. And she said, I'm still processing it and maybe this will help. And my first reaction was, maybe it won't. I mean, it's just, there's nothing particularly helpful about this poem. And yet the more I read it, and I'm writing a book now about Shakespeare and Rembrandt, and some version of this is sort of the middle panel of a 3-part chapter on the earlier of the Rembrandt paintings and the last of the last part. And it's just so weird and so difficult and so amazing to me. And I've really come to love it.
What do you think Shakespeare's basic motivation was to spend so much time and intellect on this subject? Was it a metaphor, or did he become entranced by how difficult, as you say, the entire subject matter was?
Yeah, it's a great question. I hope you could hear in the back. Clay, was that audible in the back? You're my text. I know there are mics out here now.
Can you hold up yours, David?
Texas is so wonderfully high tech. So it's a great question, and I've thought about this a lot. A couple answers to it. The Lucrece story, and if you go to the Blanton, go look at that Italian painting, because one of the things that's interesting, almost all the paintings of the suicide of Lucrece, both in Southern Europe and in Northern Europe, Lucrece is a rather voluptuous nude, which is really weird, which seems to, on the one hand, make the viewer weirdly complicit in the exposed body. You're in the position of Tarquin in some way. And that always seemed very strange to me. But the only other thing that anybody does with the Lucrece story is it's politicized, as Beacon does at the end of the talk. And so Machiavelli just occurs to me, Machiavelli has a wonderful line in the Discorsi where he says, oh, well, Lucrece was sort of the immediate cause of this rebellion against the monarchy and the establishment of the Roman Republic. I mean, that's really what's happening. That's the political change that's taking place. And then Machiavelli says, well, if this wasn't it, something else would have been, because he was just a badass all the time, and something else would have set it off. But to me, one of the really interesting things about Shakespeare is the degree to which he's really interested in Rome. And I think it's because, in a peculiar way, Shakespeare didn't, I think one of the things scholars say all the time, and it's just wrong, it's just so they can publish articles and notes and queries. I mean, every term, you read every issue, someone has found another source for something in Shakespeare, some obscure manuscript in a French abbey. And you want to say, how would he have ever seen that? No, you never could have seen it. Shakespeare's read a few books better than anybody else ever read them. Holinshed is what he knows about English history. He's read a few novella, and he's read Plutarch really carefully. And he also knows, in a sense, that what Western Europe and early modern Europe had become, this is the Renaissance, right? What's the rebirth of something? What is being reborn? As basically, Protestant Northern Europe is jumping over that Catholic Middle Ages and finding yourself in classical Rome and classical Greek. Rome, the word Britain comes from Brutus. The big identification with it. And I think what Shakespeare does, and he starts with Titus, which, by the way, doesn't have a historical source. He's interested in what are we identifying with? Why do we identify with these Romans? And the thing that people say, well, what was great about Rome, and the reason they had an empire, not exactly the reason the British eventually had an empire, was was the discipline, the stoicism. And Shakespeare goes, I keep reading this stuff. I've read Ovid, I've read Plutarch. Where's this discipline that you see? And I think he thought the whole thing was kind of a fraud. And he starts with Titus and Lucrece, published in the same year, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, Cymbeline. It's his whole career. There's a through line as he keeps, and in Cymbeline, finally, the Britons win. They, over Rome. I think he feels that, Julius Caesar, as he talks about himself, as, that the lie of his own self-imagination is being unmovable, fixed, the self-aggrandizing of the culture. And so I think it really comes from that. And he reads, here's this moment that either has been sexualized, which I think he feels is appalling, or has just been ignored as it turns into the political story that accounts for how does Rome become a republic and the monarchy get undone. And he goes, that was a real woman who experienced this. And, and the poem so brilliantly works through these things. And even the speed of the end, I don't know, is that still up there? I don't know. But the speed of that end and the inadequacy of it, with the way the word consent works both politically and morally in the poem, that's just what Shakespeare's great at. He reads a few books really hard and really sees what's complicated about them, and then finds a way of letting the language explore that space of the. That's why we read him today. That's why he's great. That's why you can't just look at books. You actually got to read them. I tried to teach him for years, and he just said, "Nah, not going to do it."
Well, let's thank David, and let's reception. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all.